Japan has recently been undergoing an increasingly pronounced military readiness process. The country's defense strategy has undergone a sharp transformation, especially in the face of renewed tensions, exacerbated by Russia's aggression in Ukraine and China's active pressure in the region, particularly in Taiwan.
Now, Japan has unveiled plans for its biggest military buildup since World War II.
Japan is changing its foreign policy strategy with the times in what it views as a more
Japan's government approved a new defense strategy, which includes historic policy changes.
Tokyo seems to have all but abandoned its traditional peaceful stance and is accelerating its goal of transforming the self-defense forces into a combat-capable army. But it is not only the Taiwan crisis or the threat of North Korea that is behind this effort. Japan has also decided to dramatically increase its defense spending in the historical context of the Kuril Islands dispute with Russia and the increasingly bitter rivalry with China. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has shaken the international environment to its core. This war in Europe was echoed in the Asia-Pacific. Japan in particular fears that Russia's aggression could be directed against it, given the decades-long unresolved crisis between Tokyo and Moscow over the Kuril Islands, the Northern Territories as Japan calls them. These islands have been in the hands of the Soviet Union and then Russia since the Second World War. Japan maintains that the territory belongs to it. However, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has once again demonstrated Moscow's uncompromising approach to territory. Tokyo worries, could Russia pull the trigger on the Kurils in the same way? That is why Japan, which has been supporting Kiev since the beginning of the Ukrainian war, is also reinforcing its own security against Russia. While concerns about Russia are growing, China is also having problems with its southern neighbors and Japan. Beijing still regards Taiwan as a breakaway province and makes no secret of its willingness to take the island militarily if necessary. Moreover, China frequently patrols the Senkaku, Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea, which are disputed with Japan, sending the message, "I have rights too." Japan has complained about violations by Chinese ships and aircraft in the region. And it does not end there. The growing rapprochement between Beijing and Moscow poses a double threat in Tokyo's eyes. The Kuril Islands dispute with Russia and the Senkaku Islands. Tensions with China are pushing Japan, Asia's second-largest economy, to intensify its war preparations. Japan sees the Taiwan Strait as the main danger point. If Beijing escalates its military pressure on Taiwan or even attempts a direct invasion, a crisis would erupt in which the United States could immediately intervene, possibly resulting in Japan's de facto involvement in the war. The government in Tokyo has long stated the principle that the fall of Taiwan would directly jeopardize Japan's security. Japan's southwestern islands, especially Okinawa, are extremely close to China. Therefore, defense experts are worried about the scenario that the Ryukyu Islands could be the next stop of the Taiwan invasion. Moreover, if the Chinese Navy opens up to the Pacific, Japan's coasts will also be threatened. In order to take measures against this picture, Tokyo has decided to double its defense budget in a short period of time. It plans to increase its defense spending, which has been below 1% of its GDP for years, to 2% within 5 years. There is a multifaceted preparation for this. Japan wants to develop cruise missiles capable of shooting down enemy missiles before they are launched, long-range weapon systems, and interceptor capabilities. It is also strengthening its command and control system and preparing the infrastructure to conduct integrated operations with the United States. Although there is not yet a fully unified command structure, as in NATO or the US-South Korea alliance, Japan is for the first time building itself into a wartime command echelon. In the event of a Taiwan conflict or a Russian-induced crisis, the self-defense forces are intended to be able to quickly integrate with US forces for collective defense. Another dimension of these preparations is to increase international cooperation. Japan has recently been playing a more visible role in the Quad format, which includes the US, Australia, and India. By intensifying its military and diplomatic relations with countries such as the Philippines and South Korea, it wants to create a counterbalance against the China and Russia axis. The Philippines in the South China Sea, Japan in the East China Sea, South Korea on the Korean Peninsula axis, the US and Australia in the Pacific. All these links are aimed at curbing the expansionist ambitions of Beijing and Moscow in the Asia-Pacific region. Even though Russia's preoccupation with Ukraine has given Japan a breather, Tokyo still does not rule out the possibility that the Kremlin may take aggressive action in the Kuril Islands in the future. Public support is growing in this direction. The country, which has long had pacifist articles in the Japanese constitution and a culture of social pacifism, is shifting to a tougher line on defense issues because of the new wave of threats. Polls show that most people support increasing the defense budget and the self-defense forces taking on a deterrent role. This support is also helping politicians. Former Prime Minister Fumio Kishida called for public awareness, saying, "Peace is not just someone else's problem." His successor, Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba, shares similar views, emphasizing that Japan must be ready for a possible conflict. The world has entered a different era. Russia's actions in Ukraine are proof of that, and China's threats against Taiwan cannot be taken lightly, the new generation of politicians said. On the Russian dimension, the Kuril Islands issue stands out. This island chain has been under de facto Soviet and then Russian control since the end of World War II. Japan has not given up on formally reclaiming them. From time to time, the leaders of the two countries have been willing to work on a peace treaty, but in the end, they have been confronted with the unresolved territorial issue. Russia's aggressive foreign policy is also raising concerns that the Kremlin may strengthen its military presence in the Kurils. With the invasion of Ukraine, Moscow made it clear that it was not interested in a peace treaty with Japan. Tokyo reacted by imposing sanctions against Russia and began to support Ukraine. Thus, the security equation in the Pacific has become intertwined with the war in Europe. On the Chinese dimension, the crisis over Taiwan and the Senkaku Islands is decisive. Japan argues that it has undisputed sovereignty over the Senkaku Islands, whereas China frequently sends naval patrols, claiming that this is historically our territory. The possibility of an invasion of Taiwan could open the door to a much bigger conflict. Because the US is sending strong messages that it will protect Taiwan, Japan could find itself in the middle of this scenario. International reports predict that if China attacks Taiwan, Japanese bases could also be targeted. Tokyo is therefore diversifying its missiles, improving its air defenses, and acquiring long-range precision strike capabilities. Although it is difficult to build a direct deterrent against nuclear-armed Russia and China, it wants to put weight on the table by upgrading its military capacity in full coordination with the United States. Historically, Japan has been a constitutionally non-aggression warrior since World War II, calling its armed forces the Self-Defense Forces. This was due to both social sensitivity and the legacy of the security treaties signed with the United States. But the Russia-Ukraine war and the Chinese threat are pushing Tokyo to turn over a new leaf. It is reforming infrastructure, logistics, and command and control, building joint US-Japan headquarters, and new bases on islands across the Pacific. Tokyo is accelerating its military buildup on the southwestern islands, especially Okinawa, in order to be prepared for both the Taiwan scenario and a possible Russian move. The deterrence capacity of the Japanese army is quite high. It has a modern air force, an advanced navy, and technological capabilities. It possesses high-tech platforms such as F-35 fighter jets, Aegis-equipped destroyers, and Soryu-class submarines. In addition, Japan plans to purchase or produce long-range cruise missiles with the concept of destroying enemy missiles before launch. Tanker aircraft, airborne early warning systems, unmanned vehicles, the self-defense forces are now preparing to take a more aggressive role in a potential conflict. Updates to the National Defense Strategy documents are moving the country from a defense-oriented mentality to one that can protect its interests from afar. But while Japan is taking these military steps, it is also facing major domestic political debates. In a society that grew up with a peaceful constitution, it is not easy to win approval for high defense spending. The huge costs may require higher taxes or result in other sectors of the budget being cut. Yet much of the public believes that passivity is not an option in a world where Russia is acting aggressively in Ukraine. If we are not prepared, actors like Russia in the north, China and North Korea in the south could come at us with open arms, the public worries. We need to strengthen not only the military but also our civil defense reflexes, the media and experts say. Another factor strengthening this resolve is Japan's support for Ukraine. Initially limited to logistical and humanitarian aid, it is gradually evolving to include more direct military involvement. By contributing to Ukraine's resistance against Russia, Japan is reportedly trying to cut off the Kremlin's energy for aggression on other fronts. In a way, the indirect benefit of helping Kiev may be to prevent Russia from embarking on new adventures in the Asia-Pacific. Similarly, Japan's close security ties with South Korea provide a common front against the North Korean and Chinese threats. While Tokyo-Seoul relations were previously problematic due to historical issues, the perception of a common threat brings them together today. Ultimately, the answer to the question, why is Japan preparing for war against China and Russia, lies in the region's hardening geopolitical landscape. Russia broke international rules with its invasion in Ukraine and may take a similar approach in the Kuril Islands. China, on the other hand, is making military threats over Taiwan and ignoring Japan's sovereignty in the East China Sea. Together with the United States, Tokyo is trying to deter what it sees as expansionism. To this end, it has embarked on military reforms, a sharp increase in defense spending, plans for new bases, and a deepening of the US-Japan alliance. Instead of self-defense forces, the foundations of a de facto army are now being laid. If the Taiwan scenario erupts, Japan is likely to be involved in the conflict. Likewise, if tensions with Russia escalate in the Kuril Islands, Tokyo knows that this time it is not alone. It will act in coordination with the US and its allies. North Korea is an additional factor. Pyongyang's nuclear and missile threats already keep Tokyo on its toes. Adding all this up, it is no surprise that Japan's military is making the biggest rearmament drive in centuries. The Tokyo government is thus poised to redraw the balance of power in the Pacific. Japanese defense planning is based on a strategy centered on the Kuriles against Russia, Taiwan, and the Senkaku against China, and a missile defense network against North Korea. Full integration with the United States, deepening relations with Australia and India, and increasingly warm ties with NATO make Japan one of the most important military and diplomatic actors in the Asia-Pacific. This position means that Tokyo will play a dominant role in future conflict scenarios. Looking back from a historical perspective, it is well known that Japan has been fighting both Russia and China on different fronts for centuries. Today, this struggle has taken on a whole new dimension with the introduction of technology, economics, and international alliances. Japan acts with the idea that we have to be ready for war in order not to go to war. The biggest question at this stage is whether this readiness will be a real deterrent and whether it will foster peace or greater tension in the region. This question will be answered by the geopolitical developments of the coming years.